Against all the evil that hell can conjure, all the wickedness that mankind can produce, we will send unto them only you. Rip and tear until it is done.
Hello everyone. I hope everyone's been enjoying the Doom soundtrack there. I am Nat. I hope at least some of you recognize me. I'm Sophie's partner. Um, I've committed to doing the occasional stream while Soph's out because I think it'll be fun and just make a little more dough. So if at any point any of you feel like you may be enjoying the stream, getting something out of the stream, do feel free to tip, cheer, donate through the PayPal link. All as much appreciated. Today I am going to be reading Automation and the Future of Work by Aaron Benanav. I was going to do a stream dunking on David Baddiel and this article interviewing him about his new book called The Male Gaze, which kind of represents to me everything that's wrong with mainstream conversations about feminism, which don't take the work of feminist theorists or organizations or activists seriously at all in the slightest. But honestly, it was making me a little too sad. So I thought I'd do something that I thought might be a little actually more useful. Soph read this a while ago, and it was really influential for her writing since, and especially for The World's Not Ending. And you know, it's only like 100 pages. I'm not gonna get through the whole thing today, obviously, but I've been wanting to read it for a while, so I thought this might be a really cool opportunity to motivate myself to read it and share it with all of you lot at the same time. I thought that might be fun, so I'll get to that in a mo. First, I will say hello to everybody. Fanboy is trans boy. Nice to see you. Pup Tetris. Chutney Kalen. Nico. Extremely good to see you here. Extra Princes. Hello. On the Rhineland. Hello. Tammy Tunes. Nat Enjoyers Rejoice. I hope there are some Nat Enjoyers here, and I hope they're all rejoicing. Cersini, hello, I'm glad you're excited for an art stream. Artist Synth, hello. Trans Salamander, that is so fucking cool. I was literally just thinking today about how I wish I could see more of her. Oh, well, you're in luck. I've also been like working away very slowly for a long time on a video that I'm planning for Soph's channel as well. So it's going to be about how specifically like the gender critical movement tries to divide and weaponize cis lesbians against trans women. And I hope people enjoy that when it comes out. Because I'm very mad about it, and so I feel like I need to say something about it. Shield Baden, always good to see ya. Octavian Soup, is this work cringe or based? All work is cringe. Tammy's Tunes. Geometric Shapes. Oh, that's a good name. That's a good name. I appreciate that. Judge Me, good to see you here. Aristo Bear, hello. Meta Claritas, finally got Twitch to notify me, so I'm here for the first time live. I'm so glad you made it here. I hope you enjoy the stream. Maddie, hello. Why is he writing all these books about being an authority on serious, complicated issues regarding David Baddiel? Yes. Yeah. And I can't even blame him because he's just being told by the whole bourgeois media class around him that he's a fucking genius, and he doesn't actually have to investigate what the male gaze even refers to start writing a book called The Male Gaze. So cringe, sad. I probably will get around to doing a stream on this subject at some point. I just felt like I'd just be repeating myself if I did it right now, so I think I need to wait a little, sit on it for a bit. I would love a Baddiel dunking stream, even if not on that specific article. Well, you're in luck because I did do a stream watching through David Baddiel apologizing to Jason Lee in service of his TV show about anti-Semitism, because he does he's positioned himself in a role speaking authoritatively on racism in general without really investigating the structures that create racism or doing any of the work in general. Nat is more fun to have around though when there's also Sophie, because we can hear her be gay about Nat. Well, don't worry about that. There's more liberal slop streams with the two of us coming up. I hope you enjoy them. The doom music has sure made cooking dinner more intense. I was enjoying that. I was rocking out. Alright. Spectra Wrestles, hello. Good to see you here. All right. I am gonna start my reading. Automation and the Future of Work by Benanav. Let us begin. The internet, smartphones, and social media have already transformed so much about the way we interact with each other and come to know the world. What would happen if these digital technologies moved off the screen and increasingly integrated themselves into the physical world around us? Advanced industrial robotics, self-driving cars and trucks, and intelligent cancer screening machines appear to presage a world of ease, but they also make us uneasy. After all, what would human beings do in a largely automated future? Would we be able to adapt our institutions to realize the dream of human freedom that a new age of intelligent machines might make possible? Or would that dream turn out to be a nightmare of mass technological unemployment? In 2 New Left Review articles published in 2019, I identified a new automation discourse propounded by liberal, right-wing, and left analysts alike. Asking just these sorts of questions, automation theorists arrive at a provocative conclusion. Mass technological unemployment is coming and can be managed only by the provision of universal basic income, since large sections of the population will lose access to the wages they need to survive. In this book, I argue that the resurgence of the automation discourse today is a response to a real trend unfolding across the world. There are simply too few jobs for too many people. This chronic labour under demand is manifest in economic trends such as jobless recoveries, stagnant wages, and rampant job insecurity. It is visible as well in the political phenomena that rising inequality catalyses: populism, plutocracy, and the rise of a new seasteading digital elite, more focused on escaping in rockets to Mars than on improving the livelihoods of the digital peasantry who will be left behind on a burning planet Earth. Catching up with the chat. Communism. Human beings would need to do communism. Yes, I agree. UBI is just giving you tokens for the casino. This is Sophie's metaphor that I really appreciate. If you get free tokens when you walk into a casino, it doesn't mean you're winning the game. The game's still rigged. Pointing with one hand to the homeless and jobless masses of Oakland, California, and with the other to the robots staffing the Tesla production plant just a few miles away in Fremont, it is easy to believe that the automation theorists must be right. I'm gonna get smoother at reading, I promise. As I go along, I'm gonna get into it. My reading's gonna be so smooth. You're gonna be lapping up automation and the future of work. However, the explanation they offer, that runaway technological change is destroying jobs, is simply false. There is a real and persistent under-demand for labour in the United States and European Union, and even more so in countries such as South Africa, India, and Brazil, yet its cause is almost the opposite of the one identified by the automation theorists. In reality, rates of labour productivity growth are slowing down, not speeding up. That should have increased the demand for labour, except that the productivity slowdown was overshadowed by another, more eventful trend. In a development originally analysed by Marxist... Might have to deal with that in a minute. By Marxist economist Robert Brenner under the title of The Long Downturn, and belatedly recognised by mainstream economists as secular stagnation, or Japanification, economies have been growing at a progressively slower pace. The cause: Decades of industrial overcapacity killed the manufacturing growth engine, and no alternative to it has been found, least of all in the slow-growing, low-productivity activities that make up the bulk of the service sector. Hello, Sleepy Leo. I am reading Automation and the Future of Work by Benanav. And this is a book that Sophie found really influential when she was writing The World Is Not Ending, and I've been wanting to read it for ages, so I thought it would be a good motivation to read it on stream with everybody and see what everybody thinks. As economic growth decelerates, rates of job creation slow, and it is this, not technology-induced job destruction, that has depressed the global demand for labour. Put on the reality vision glasses of John Carpenter's They Live, which allowed the protagonist of that film to see the truth in advertising, and it is easy to see a world not of shiny, new automated factories and ping-pong playing consumer robots, but of crumbling infrastructures, deindustrialized cities, harried nurses, and underpaid salespeople, as well as a massive stock of financialized capital, with dwindling places to invest itself. What we're talking about here is the crisis of capitalism. In an effort to revive stagnant economies, governments spent almost a half century imposing punishing austerity on their populations, underfunding schools, hospitals, public transportation networks, and welfare programs. At the same time, in a world of ultra-low interest rates, governments, businesses, and households took on record quantities of debt. They did not do so to invest in our digital future, as former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan argued they would in the midst of the late 1990s tech bubble. Instead, firms mortgaged their assets to pay off shareholders, while poorer households borrowed in an effort to make ends meet. I love economics perverts taking off as a phrase, Ashrad. It was one of my favourite lines, the finance pervert spinning the finance wheel to flood her ugly house in Sophie's video. These trends have left the world economy in an incredibly poor position as it faces one of its greatest challenges, the COVID-19 recession. Dilapidated healthcare systems have been overrun with patients, and schools have closed that were, for many children, vital sources of basic nutrition, and for parents of much-needed childcare. Meanwhile, the economy is tanking. Heavily indebted companies watch their stock values plummet, at least initially, at rates not seen since the Great Depression. Unemployment rates rose significantly across the world and stratospherically in the United States, leaving large parts of the population unable to pay for food, medical care, or housing. In spite of massive monetary and fiscal stimuli, weak economies are unlikely to bounce back quickly from the shock. It is easy to see how, over the long term, the COVID-19 recession will accelerate what are, by now, long unfolding trends of rising economic insecurity and inequality. It is precisely for this reason that it is so important to reflect upon today's automation discourse. Automation theorists offer a utopian reply to our dystopian world. Remove the they live reality vision glasses and return for a moment to the world of fantasy, inhabited by these authors. In it, we all work less, like the victims of the present recession, yet have access to everything we need to make a life. We spend more time with our families, but not because we are in imposed isolation. The elderly jog through parks wearing new exoskeleton jumpsuits, rather than dying in hospital beds. And the air has been cleared of smog because we are transitioning rapidly to a world of renewable energy, rather than because factories have been shuttered and people are no longer driving cars. With the exception of exoskeleton jumpsuits, all of this is possible now if we fight for it. We can already achieve the post-scarcity world that the automation theorists invoke, even if the automation of production proves impossible. My interest in this topic arose from two distinct sources, one in the deeper past and the other more recent. Like many of the automation theorists, I grew up in the 1980s and 90s reading science fiction novels and watching the spacefaring communists of Star Trek: The Next Generation tour the galaxy. Yeah. Woo, woo! Oh, thank you, Malinoria. That's very nice to hear, because I do get nervous that I don't have a nice reading voice. I'm very glad. Hello, Weirdo of Oz. I'm very glad to be keeping you company whilst you're sewing. That's really cool. Phenomenological Cat. I'm pretty sure this book was written after Mark Fisher died, unfortunately. It was published in 2020 and references the pandemic in the preface. So, My father, who inspired these interests, was himself a researcher in the field of automation. Like many of his peers, he left a career in academia to try his luck in the startup culture of the 1990s. Some people made a lot of money in those years, but many more did not. Most internet startups went bust, leaving their overworked engineers with little to show for their efforts. Interning with him at a different company every summer of high school, writing HTML and JavaScript, I decided that there was little promise of happiness to be found in the digital economy. So I devoted myself instead to studying the history of economic growth and unemployment, the twin engines of prosperity and insecurity in the contemporary economy. In the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, I became involved in the social movements of my time, an experience I attempted to digest through conversation and collaboration with fellow members of the EndNotes Collective. The unsigned, co-authored texts we wrote have greatly influenced the analysis to be found in these pages. It was through an encounter with two critics, Nick Srinacek and Alex Williams, whose Inventing the Future 2015 is a key example of the left-wing automation discourse, that I discovered the intellectual ecosystem populated by the automation theorists, which led me back to my childhood love of science fiction and at the same time transformed my outlook on the future. Metaclaritas, I would say that this book is specifically not taking for granted that we don't already have enough production for post-scarcity. It's very much a criticism of that, of those perspectives. It's very much saying we already have what we need, and it's because of capitalism that we're forced into scarcity, isolation, alienation, unemployment rather than leisure. Yeah. Liberal slot mode, that's okay. As I read book after book by the automation theorists, supplementing that still growing reading list with forays into the utopian and science fiction literatures of the past, the conviction grew within me that, collectively, these authors had done more than anyone I have yet encountered to think through the logical organization of a post-capitalist society and to imagine the pathways by which we might get there. I disagreed with their analysis of the present, but saw responding to their vision of the future as a way to develop my own. which, by comparison with theirs, was still of the dullest possible grey. In the pages that follow, I explore possibilities for achieving a post-scarcity future without the full automation of production, by sharing the work that remains to be done in a way that restores dignity, autonomy, and purpose to working life without making work the centre of our shared social existence. We are ever vigilant for slop nowadays. In the course of an exposition and critique of the automation discourse, I lay out a brief history of what has happened to the world economy and its workforce over the past 50 years, focusing on the origins and development of the present-day chronically low demand for labour. I discuss the policy alternatives that aim to resolve this market failure: neoliberal structural adjustment, Keynesian demand management, and universal basic income. This book is probably the strongest reason that Sophie speaks so strongly about UBI not being a plan for the future. It's something that she believed already, but this book really shored that up. So I'm kind of keen to see keen to understand his specific analysis, and sketch out a post-scarcity world against which they should be measured. Writing this book has only further convinced me that turning the tide toward a more humane future will depend on the refusal of masses of working people to accept a persistent decline in the demand for their labour and the rising economic inequality it entails. Struggles against these outcomes were unfolding with increasing intensity across the globe before the COVID-19 recession, and have recently resurged. We need to immerse ourselves in the movements born of these struggles, helping to drive them forward. If they fail, maybe the best we will get is a slightly higher social wage in the form of universal basic income, a proposal governments are now testing out as a possible response to the present recession. We should not be fighting for this modest social goal, but rather to inaugurate a post-scarcity planet. I could not have written... that's names and stuff. That's not for the stream, that's okay. Okay, before I get started on chapter 1, the automation discourse, I am going to shut the window upstairs because I can hear all the traffic outside, which tells me you can probably hear some of that traffic too. So I'm gonna make it a little gentler on the ears, and I'll be back in a mo. Okie dokie, chapter 1. Remember, everyone, if you are enjoying the stream, if you're learning anything, if you're enjoying it, please do consider paying for the stream via tips or subscribing or cheering. We love it all. Chapter 1, the automation discourse. Rapid advances in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics seem set to transform the world of work. In the most advanced factories in the world, companies like Tesla are pushing toward lights-out production, in which fully automated processes, no longer needing human hands, can run in the dark. Meanwhile, in the illuminated halls of robotics conventions, machines are on display that can play ping pong, cook food, have sex, and even hold conversations. Computers are not only generating new strategies for playing Go, but are said to be writing symphonies that will bring audiences to tears. Dressed in white lab coats or donning virtual suits, computers are learning to identify cancers and will soon be put to work developing legal strategies. Trucks are already barreling across the United States without drivers. Robotic dogs are carrying military-grade weapons across desolate plains. Are we living in the last days of human toil? Is what Edward Bellamy once called the Edict of Eden about to be revoked, as men, or at least the wealthiest among us, become like gods? Shield Baden, yes, that's his bad thing. There are many reasons to doubt the hype. For one thing, machines remain comically incapable of opening doors or, alas, folding laundry. Robotic security guards are toppling into mall fountains. Computerized digital assistants can answer questions and translate documents, but not well enough to do the job without human intervention. The same is true of self-driving cars. In 2014, in the midst of the American Fight for 15 movement, billboards went up in San Francisco threatening to replace fast food workers with touchscreens if a law raising the minimum wage was passed. Those bastards, what the hell? They put up billboards. The Wall Street Journal dubbed the bill the Robot Employment Act. Yet fast food workers in Europe already work alongside touchscreens, often earning better pay than comparable workers in the United States. So is the talk of automation overblown? I won't respect robot labor until they can wash my pants. That's completely appropriate. You should not respect any robot labor until they can wash pants. In the pages of newspapers and popular magazines, scarce stories about automation remain just so much idle chatter. However, over the past decade, this talk has crystallized into an influential social theory that purports not only to analyze current technologies and predict their future, but also to explore the consequences of technological change for society at large. The automation discourse rests on 4 principal positions. First, it argues, workers are already being displaced by ever more advanced machines, resulting in rising levels of technological unemployment. Second, this displacement is a sure sign that we are on the verge of achieving a largely automated society, in which nearly all work will be performed by self-moving machines and intelligent computers. Third, although automation should entail humanity's collective liberation from toil, we live in a society where most people must work in order to live, meaning this dream may well turn out to be a nightmare. Fourth, therefore, the only way to prevent a mass unemployment catastrophe like the one unfolding in the United States in 2020, although for very different reasons, is to institute a universal basic income, breaking the connection between the size of the incomes people earn and the amount of work they do. Sophie's in the chat. Sophie says, "Hey everyone, I'm taking Nat to Paris at the end of the month for her B-Day. If you don't donate now, you'll be contributing to her B-Day present." So, oh, I just saw Trans Salamander tipped earlier. Thank you. And also on the Ryland tipped. That's very, very kind of you both. Thank you very much. The machines are coming. Self-described futurists are the major disseminators of this automation discourse. In the widely read Second Machine Age, Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee argue that we find ourselves at an inflection point, a bend in the curve where many technologies that used to be found only in science fiction are becoming everyday reality. New technologies promise an enormous bounty, but Brynjolfsson and McAfee caution, there is no economic law that says all workers, or even a majority of workers, will benefit from these advances. On the contrary, as the demand for labour falls with the adoption of more advanced technologies, wages are stagnating. A rising share of annual income is therefore being captured by capital rather than by labour. The result is growing inequality, which could slow our journey into what they call a new machine age by generating a failure mode of capitalism. That's their quote. In which rentier extraction crowds out technological innovation. Good luck finding a bathroom in Central, Sophie. Out of curiosity, what page are we on? We are on page 3. For anyone who wants to read along at home, their copy of Automation and the Future of Work by Aaron Benanav. And actually, I'm quite excited about reading this book on stream because it's just a little dinky little thing. It's about 100 pages long, with a very strong argument. So, I'm excited. I hope you enjoy. In Rise of the Robots, Martin Ford similarly claims that we are pushing towards a tipping point that is posed to make the entire economy less labour-intensive. Again, the most frightening long-term scenario of all might be if the global economic system eventually manages to adapt to the new reality, leading to the creation of automated feudalism in which the peasants would be largely superfluous and the elite impervious to economic demands. So I'm realizing as I'm reading that there's an issue that it's going to be hard to tell when I'm reading quotes unless I make a point of it. And I'm recognizing why in audiobooks that I listen to, they often do a bit of a funny voice for the quotes that I'm reading. So I'm going to try do that just to make it a little clearer when I'm reading quotes versus when I'm reading the original text. So I'm just going to redo that a little bit with the voices, okay? In Rise of the Robots, Martin Ford similarly claims that we are pushing towards a tipping point that is poised to make the entire economy less labor intensive. How am I going to do the voice? What kind of, I need a better voice. Again, the most frightening long-term scenario. No, that was bad. I need to do a better voice. I was trying to do an American accent, but it didn't come out good. Maybe I'll do a posho voice, right? Again, the most frightening long-term scenario of all might be if the global economic system eventually manages to adapt to the new reality. Okay, I think I can keep that one up. Leading to the creation of automated feudalism, in which the peasants would be largely superfluous and the elite impervious to economic demands. Okay, we'll see how we go with that. For these authors, education and retraining will not be enough to stabilize labor demand in an automated economy. Some form of guaranteed non-wage income, such as a negative income tax, must be put in place. This automation discourse has been enthusiastically adopted by the jeans-wearing elite of Silicon Valley. Bill Gates advocated for a robots tax. Bill Gates. Mark Zuckerberg told Harvard undergraduate inductees to explore ideas like universal basic income, a policy Elon Musk also thinks will become increasingly necessary over time as robots outcompete humans across a growing range of jobs. Musk gave his SpaceX drone vessels names like "Of Course I Shall Still Love You" and "Just Read the Instructions," which he lifted from the names of spaceships in Ian M. Banks' Culture series. Banks' ambiguously utopian science fiction novels depict a post-scarcity world in which human beings live fulfilling lives out alongside intelligent robots called minds without the need for markets or states. And now Elon Musk is charging people to go on Twitter. So. Politicians and their advisors have equally identified with the automation discourse, which has become one of the leading perspectives on our digital future. In his farewell presidential address, Barack Obama suggested that the next wave of economic dislocations will come not from overseas trade, but rather from the relentless pace of automation that makes a lot of good middle-class jobs obsolete. Robert Reich, former Labour Secretary under Bill Clinton, expressed similar fears. We will soon reach a point where technology is displacing so many jobs, not just menial jobs, but also professional jobs, that we're going to have to take seriously the notion of a universal basic income. I hope everyone's enjoying the voice. Clinton's former Treasury Secretary, Lawrence Summers, made the same admission. Once stupid ideas about technological unemployment now seem increasingly smart, he said, as workers' wages stagnate and economic inequality rises. The discourse even became the basis of a long-shot presidential campaign for 2020. Andrew Yang, Obama's former ambassador of global entrepreneurship, penned his own tome on automation titled The War on Normal People. That's a grim title. And ran a futuristic campaign on a Humanity First platform, introducing UBI into mainstream American politics for the first time in 2 generations. Among Yang's supporters was Andy Stern, former head of the Service Employees International Union, whose raising the floor is yet another example of the discourse. Hello, there is no choice left. I am reading Automation and the Future of Work by Aaron Benanav, which is a book that I've been meaning to read for a long time, that was quite influential for Sophie, working on general thoughts and the world is not ending. So Yang and Stern, like all of the other writers named so far, take pains to assure readers that some variant of capitalism is here to stay, even if it must jettison its labour markets. However, they admit to the influence of figures on the far left who offer a more radical version of the automation discourse. In Inventing the Future, Nick Cernusek, I'm very sorry, please correct me on pronunciation if everybody knows, and Alex Williams argue that the most recent wave of automation is poised to transform the labour market drastically, as it comes to encompass every aspect of the economy. They claim that only a socialist government would actually be able to fulfill the promise of full automation by creating a post-work or post-scarcity society. Thank you, Cedarit, for tipping specifically for the funny voices. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Shield Baden. I'm looking forward. I'm gonna be a 31-year-old lady. It's gonna be good. All right. In Four Futures, Peter Fraze thoughtfully explores the alternative outcomes for such a post-scarcity society, depending on whether it were still to have private property or to suffer from resource scarcity, both of which could persist even if labour scarcity were overcome. Like the liberal proponents of the automation discourse, these left-wing writers stress that even if the coming of advanced robotics is inevitable, there is no necessary progression into a post-work world. Cernusek, Williams, and Fraze are all proponents of UBI, but in a left-wing variant. For them, UBI serves as a bridge to fully automated luxury communism. A term Aaron Bastani coined in 2014 to name a possible goal of socialist politics. This term flourished for 5 years as a meme before Bastani's book. I was going to say, I thought I recognized it as a meme from years and years and years ago. I didn't realize that people were saying that it actually came from Aaron Bastani coining it in the first place. This term flourished for 5 years as a meme before Bastani's book, outlining an automated future in which artificial intelligence, solar power, gene editing, asteroid mining, and lab-grown meat generate a world of limitless leisure and self-invention, finally appeared. It provided a much-needed counterweight to left-wing rhetorics of collective self-sacrifice and anti-consumerist austerity. I believe there's a much happier place in between those two things. Recurrent fears. These futurist visions, arising from all points along the political spectrum, depend upon a shared prediction about the trajectory of technological change. If anything, the confidence that is characteristic of the automation discourse has only increased in the midst of the pandemic recession. Although technological change was not itself the cause of job loss, at least this time around, automation theorists argue that the spread of the pandemic will hasten the transition to a more automated future. Lost jobs will never return since, unlike their human counterparts, cooking, cleaning, recycling, grocery bagging, and caretaking robots can neither catch COVID-19 nor transmit it to others. Have the automation theorists got this story right? To answer this question, it is helpful to have a couple of working definitions. Automation may be distinguished from other forms of labor-saving technical innovation in that automation technologies fully substitute for human labor, rather than merely augmenting human productive capacities. With labor-augmenting technologies, a given job category will continue to exist, but each worker in that category will be more productive. For example, the addition of new machines to a car assembly line will make line work more efficient without abolishing line work as such. Fewer line workers will be needed in total to produce any given number of automobiles. Whether such technical change results in job destruction depends on the relative speeds of productivity and output growth in the automotive industry. If output grows more slowly than labour productivity, a common case, as we will see below, then the number of jobs will decline. This is true even without automation entering the picture. By contrast, true automation takes place, as Kurt Vonnegut suggested in his novel Player Piano, when an entire job classification has been eliminated. Poof! No matter how much production increases, there will never be another telephone switchboard operator or hand manipulator of rolled steel. Here, machines have fully substituted for human labour. Octavian Soup says gay. Yeah, I agree. Gay is an essential part of the meme. Ashran says there is literally not enough silicon on Earth for the number of solar panels we would need for this. This is why I'm all about we slow down, we chill out, we enjoy our lives. We don't have to be making, producing. Let's please just be allowed to enjoy our lives. I'm glad you're enjoying the funny quotes voice, Cersei. Ashrand, we can have more breaks and less stuff. Yes, please. Like, honestly, like, who wants, like, more choices of different colored clocks versus the time to make the clock you have whatever color you like, because you can sit down and paint it. Like, just the time to chill out and rest and have leisure and friends and family and fully know and trust that you can, like, care for them as they need and they can care for you as you need. Wouldn't that be nice? Just thinking about that, just thinking about having all the people around you kind of knowing that you have the time and space and resources to care for each other as we would like to. Shield Baden says, no, automation should just give us more time for side hustles. Gotta stay hustling. Excellent. Okay. Much of the debate around the future of workplace automation turns, unhelpfully, on an evaluation of the degree to which present or near future technologies are labour substituting or labour augmenting in character. Distinguishing between these two types of technical change is more difficult than one might suppose. When a retailer installs 4 self-checkout machines, watched over and periodically adjusted by a single employee, has cashiering ended as an occupation, or is each cashier now operating 3 additional registers? Taking an extreme view on such issues, one famous study from the Oxford Martin School suggested that 47% of jobs in the United States are at high risk of automation. A more recent study from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, predicts that 14% of jobs are at high risk, with another 32% at risk of significant change in the way they are carried out, due to innovations that augment labour rather than substitute for it. Hello, Mad Dog Idaho. Good to have you here. In fact, both types of technical change can be expected to leave many workers without jobs. It is unclear, however, whether even the highest of these estimates suggests a qualitative break with the past has taken place. By one count, 57% of the jobs were... I didn't do the voice. By one count, 57% of the jobs workers did in the 1960s no longer exist today. Alongside other forms of technical change, automation has been a persistent source of job loss over time. The question I address here is not whether new automation technologies will destroy additional jobs in the future. The answer is certainly yes. It is whether these technologies, advanced robotics, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, have so accelerated the rate of job destruction and so diminished the rate of new job creation that increasing numbers of people are already finding themselves permanently unemployed. Shield Aiden says, I just realized how automation is going to make striking harder, and that scares me. That is what automation has always been for, specifically. So, I was planning to get to describing this at some point whilst reading this book, but it's completely demonstrative. In Fossil Capital, Andreas Malm describes how one of the kind of earliest crises of capitalism, of emerging capitalism, happened, and how that prompted the adoption of fossil fuels and industrial machinery. So the textile industry in the UK was booming. There was massive profits because they were relying on slave labor. They were relying on slave labor for their cotton to make their textiles from. The banks were therefore, and businesses were therefore handing out massive loans, like just seemed to have infinite money available for people who wanted to get into, or for capitalists who wanted to get into or expand in the textiles industry in the UK, because they seemed to be making just endless, enormous profits. And so they wanted to be putting as much investment into that industry as possible. A crisis of overproduction happened because they made so much cotton textiles that there was so much competition that the prices had to be dropped, because there was nobody, there just wasn't a market for consuming all of those textiles at that price. And so all of this suddenly crowded industry sector needed to force the profit loss down, obviously, onto the workers, which is what they always do when they start to lose profits. And they decided to do this, obviously in response to the capitalists cutting the workers' wages. The workers organised and went on strike. And in response, the capitalists adopted the use of automation processes to de-skill and divide and make replaceable the workforce, so that they could keep their wages low, so that they could recoup some of the profits that they had lost through overproduction and competition. Like, overproduction is the problem of capitalism, the competition creating overproduction, and then the bubble necessarily bursts. This just happens over and over again with every new gold rush, right? And I just think I need to communicate this to as many people as possible. Everyone needs to understand that, like, when we're talking about things like degrowth or like slowing down our economy, producing less, we're not talking about scarcity for people. We're talking about refusing a model of the economy that means that producing more means people work less, like have less regular employment, and sorry, this is the wrong way around. That overproduction means that people are forced into unemployment and poverty rather than like producing things according to our needs means that we have leisure and time to spare and enjoy. Anyway, I shall carry on. If so, that would completely upend the normal functioning of capitalist economies. This insight, on which the automation theory is based, was stated most succinctly by Nobel Prize winning economist Wassily Leontief in 1983. The effective operation of the automatic price mechanism, he explained, depends critically on a peculiar feature of modern technology, namely that in spite of bringing about an unprecedented rise in total output, it nevertheless strengthened the dominant role of human labour in most kinds of productive processes. In other words, technology has made workers more productive without making their work itself unnecessary. Since workers continue to earn wages, their demand for goods is effective. At any time, a technological breakthrough could destroy this fragile pin holding capitalist societies together. Artificial general intelligence, for example, might eliminate many occupations in a single stroke, rendering large quantities of labour unsaleable at any price. At that point, information about the preferences of large sections of the population would vanish from the market, rendering it inoperable. Drawing on this insight and adding that such a breakthrough now exists, automation theorists frequently argue that capitalism must be a transitory mode of production, which will give way to a new form of life that does not organize itself around wage work and monetary exchange. Sometimes I just hear the kind of futurists planning their utopian futures and I feel so sad for them because we could have communism now. We could just be chilling. We could just be chilling, having fun, taking care of each other, enjoying it. You know, just enjoying it. Ashran says, artificial general intelligence is just so much a nonsense subject. Sophie's working on a video about it right now, and I'm so excited about it. I'm sure you're going to really enjoy it. Wizard of Oz, this is like getting to know the futurist from Half-Earth Socialism better. Yeah, that's exactly what he's talking about. Automation may be a constant feature of capitalist societies. The same is not true of the theory of a coming age of automation, which extrapolates from instances of technological change to a broader account of social transformation. On the contrary, its recurrence in modern history has been periodic. Excitement about a coming age of automation can be traced back to at least the mid-19th century, with the publication of Charles Babbage's On the Economy of Machinery and Manufactures in 1832, John Adolphus Etzler's The Paradise Within the Reach of All Men Without Labour in 1833, and Andrew Ur's The Philosophy of Manufacturers in 1835. These books presaged the imminent emergence of largely or fully automated factories run with minimal or merely supervisory human labour. Their vision was a major influence on Marx, whose Capital argued that a complex world of interacting machines was in the process of displacing human labour from the centre of economic life. Visions of automated factories appeared again in the 1930s, 1950s, and 1980s, before re-emerging in the 2010s. Each time, they were accompanied or shortly followed by predictions of a coming age of catastrophic unemployment and social breakdown, which could be prevented only if society were reorganized. To point out the periodicity of this discourse is not to say that its accompanying social visions should be dismissed. For one thing, the technological breakthroughs presaged by the automation discourse could still be achieved at any time. Just because they were wrong in the past does not necessarily mean that they will always be wrong in the future. More than that, these visions of automation have clearly been generative in social terms. They point to certain utopian possibilities latent within capitalist societies. Indeed, some of the most visionary socialists of the 20th century either were automation theorists or were inspired by them, including Herbert Marcuse, James Boggs, and Andre Gause. Please, someone ask why this keeps coming up. Please, why do they keep saying this will come soon and this always looks the same? Taking its periodicity into account, automation theory may be described as a spontaneous discourse of capitalist societies that, for a mixture of structural and contingent reasons, reappears in those societies time and again as a way of thinking through their limits. What summons the automation discourse periodically into being is a deep anxiety about the functioning of the labour market. There are simply too few jobs for too many people. Why is the market unable to provide jobs for so many of the workers who need them? Proponents of the automation discourse explain this problem of low demand for labour in terms of runaway technological change. Too few jobs. If the automation discourse appeals so widely again today, it is because the ascribed consequences of automation are all around us. Global capitalism is failing to provide jobs. I'm going to show you this. Sophie's just highlighted that the sentence is, global capitalism is failing to provide jobs for many of the people who need them. And Sophie's just highlighted, global capitalism is failing. True. That's true. There has been, in other words, a persistently low demand for labour, one which is no longer adequately registered in unemployment statistics. Labour under demand is reflected in higher spikes of unemployment during recessions, as in the 2020 pandemic recession, and in increasingly jobless recoveries, a phenomenon likely to be repeated in the pandemic recession's aftermath. Low labour demand has been evident as well in a trend with more generic consequences for working people, a decline in the share of all income earned in a given year that is distributed as wages rather than profits. Mainstream economists long held the steadiness of the labour share to be a stylized fact of economic growth, which was supposed to ensure that the gains of economic development were widely distributed. In spite of massive accumulations of so-called human capital in the form of rising educational attainments and healthier lives, the labour share of income in G7 countries has fallen for decades. Here is an answer. Lower the pension age every year until the demand for labour comes back. I like it. There's a start. Such shifts signal a radical reduction in workers' bargaining power, and the typical worker has faced harsher realities than even these statistics suggest, since wage growth has become increasingly skewed toward the highest earners, the infamous 1%. Growing gaps have not only widened between the average growth rates of labour productivity and of wages, which cumulatively causes the labour share of income to fall, but also between the growth rates of average wages and median wages, which evinces a shift in labour incomes from production and non-supervisory workers toward managers and CEOs. Growth in the rates of average wage, but also between the growth rates of average and median. Yeah, I think that means the wages at the bottom getting worse. The result is that many workers have seen a vanishingly thin slice of economic growth. Under these conditions, rising economic inequality will be contained only by the strength of redistributive programs. However, the politics of social solidarity have been weakening over time. Even critics of the automation discourse, such as economists David Autor and Robert J. Gordon, are disturbed by these trends. Something has gone wrong with the economy, leading to a low demand for labour. Ashwan says, this is the problem. The cost of living crisis here in the UK has gotten people at the top all excited that pensioners are returning to the job market. Yeah, that's horrific. I remember, like, years ago, it was after the recession, there was a lot of horrific anti-immigration conversation because people were, you know, looking for people to blame for like decreasing wages other than capitalism. And the fact was that and for like a lack of job supply, and the fact was that older people, the biggest sort of slack of jobs being taken were being taken by older people having to stay in the labour market and stay in work rather than being able to retire. Anyway. And we've got some graphs showing the labour share of income in G7 economies going down and down and down between 1980 and 2015. And the productivity wage gap. Okay. Has runaway technological change been the cause of the low demand for labour, as proponents of the automation theory suggest? I will join critics of that theory in arguing that it has not. However, along the way, I will also criticise the critics, both for providing alternative explanations of a persistently low labour demand that apply only in high-income countries, and for failing to produce anything like a radical vision of social change adequate to the scale of the global labour under-demand problem, which has already beset the world economy for a long time and, due to COVID-19, is likely to worsen in years to come. It should be said from the outset that I am more sympathetic to the left wing of the automation discourse than to any of its critics. Even if the explanation they offer turns out to be inadequate, the automation theorists have at least focused the world's attention on the real problem of a consistently low demand for labour. They have also excelled in efforts to imagine solutions to this problem that are broadly emancipatory in character. The automation theorists are our late-stage capitalist utopians. In a world reeling from a global pandemic, rising inequality, recalcitrant neoliberalism, resurgent ethno-nationalism, and the looming threat of climate change, automation theorists have tried to push through the catastrophe with a vision of an emancipated future, one in which humanity advances to the next stage in our history, whatever we might take that to mean. And technology helps to free us all to discover and follow our passions. That is true in spite of the fact that, as with many of the utopias of the past, these visions need to be freed from their authors' technocratic fantasies as to how constructive social change might take place. In responding to the automation discourse, the following chapters advance 4 counterarguments. First, I argue that the decline in the demand for labour of the past decades was due not to an unprecedented leap in technological innovation, but to ongoing technical change in an environment of deepening economic stagnation. Second, I contend that this under-demand for labour has tended to manifest not as mass unemployment, but rather as persistent underemployment. Third, I point out that the resulting world of poorly paid workers will continue to be accepted or even welcomed by elites, meaning technological advances will by no means automatically entail the adoption of technocratic solutions like universal basic income. Meanwhile, even if UBI is introduced, it is much more likely that it will prop up a world of massive inequality than help dismantle it. Fourth, I explain how we might create a world of abundance even without the full or nearly full automation of production. I then project a path by which we might get there through social struggle rather than administrative intervention. Historically, major shifts in social policy have been adopted only under massive pressure, such as the threat of communism or of civilizational collapse. Communism or collapse? Which would we... I choose communism. Today, policy reforms could emerge in response to pressure coming from a new mass social movement aiming to change the basic makeup of the social order. Instead of fearing that movement, we need to see ourselves as part of it, helping to articulate its goals and paths forward. If that movement is defeated, maybe the best we will get is UBI. But that distributional reform should not be our aim. We should be reaching toward a post-scarcity world, a goal that advanced technologies will help us realize even if the full automation of production is not achievable or even desirable. The return of the automation discourse has been a symptom of our era, as it was in times past. It has arisen when the gap between the supply and demand for jobs becomes so large, leaving so many individuals scrambling to find scraps of work, that people begin to question the viability of a market-regulated society. Even prior to the outbreak of COVID-19, the breakdown of the labour market mechanism was more extreme than at any time in the past. This is because, over the past half a century, a greater share of the world's population than ever came to depend on selling its labour, or the simple products of its labour, to survive in the context of weakening global economic growth rates. Our present reality is better described by near-future science fiction dystopias than by standard economic analysis. Ours is a hot planet, with micro-drones flying over the heads of the street hawkers and rickshaw pullers, where the rich live in guarded, climate-controlled communities, while the rest of us while away our time in dead-end jobs, playing video games on smartphones. We need to slip out of this timeline and into another, a post-scarcity future in which all individuals are guaranteed access to whatever they need to make a life, without exception, could become the basis on which humanity mounts a battle against climate change. It could also be the foundation on which we remake the world, creating the conditions in which, as James Boggs puts it, for the first time in human history, great masses of people will be free to explore and reflect, to question and to create, to learn and to teach, unhampered by the fear of where the next meal is coming from. To find our way toward this post-scarcity future requires not only a break between work and income, as the automation theorists recognize, but also one between profit and income, as many do not. How we liking it so far? How we liking it? How we liking it? If anybody happens to be enjoying the stream, they may want to consider paying for the stream. If they like, we can tip, can subscribe, can cheer. Wizard of Oz says, my additions are making it a lot more understandable. I'm really glad. I know I always find it like a little bit hard to absorb information when I'm just listening. Like my ideal is always kind of reading and listening at the same time. But I'm glad that kind of talking things over a little bit between reading is helping a little. Okay. We've read the preface in the first chapter already. We're nailing this. Well done us. That's a whole book that we're reading right now. That's the whole chapter just gone. Aw, that's nice, Weirdo of Us. That's really nice to hear. Ashran says, I'm getting variously angry in chat perhaps, but the book is good. I'm glad you're enjoying it. I can see that you're really thinking along the right lines, and that's really exciting to see. I think everything that you're saying, basically, the book, like, completely agrees with you. And that, like, perhaps some of the places where you're sort of getting caught up afterwards is basically the book is taking a bit more time to get there to sort of explain the in-betweens. But I'm excited to see all your comments in chat because like you're just totally spot on. Okay, chapter 2, Labour's global deindustrialization. If technologically induced job destruction is to have widespread social ramifications, it will have to eliminate employment in the service sector, which has absorbed 74% of workers in high-income countries and 52% worldwide. Purveyors of the automation discourse therefore focus on new forms of service sector automation in retail, transportation, and food services, where robotization is said to be gathering steam, with a growing army of machines that take orders, stock shelves, drive cars, and flip burgers. Many more service sector jobs, including some that require years of education and training, will supposedly be rendered obsolete in the coming years due to advances in artificial intelligence. Of course, these claims are mostly predictions about the effects that technologies will have on future patterns of employment. Such predictions can go wrong, as for example in the first week of January 2020, when 3 espresso and burger-slinging robotics firms in the Bay Area either closed or were forced to cut their losses. Wow, robot is such a cool word. I wonder what it means. No tech bros ever. Yes. Yes. I can see that an ad break's coming up and it's so annoying. Can I snooze it? Snooze 3 of 3? What does that mean? I got a wee anyway, so since we're at the start of the next chapter, I'm gonna take a little wee break. You enjoy your sewings and potentially this ad that's gonna come on in 50 seconds. I'm back, baby! Thasmadar, thank you so much for gifting subs to everyone. That's really kind of you. Right, where to get to? Where did I get to? That's the question. In the first week of January 2020, when 3 espresso and burger slinging robotics firms in the Bay Area either closed or were forced to cut their losses. There we go, that's where we are. In making their case, automation theorists often point to the manufacturing sector as the precedent for what they imagine is beginning to happen in services. In manufacturing, the employment apocalypse has already taken place. This is another quote that Sophie highlighted. To evaluate those theorists' claims, it therefore makes sense to begin by looking at what role automation has played in that sector's fate. After all, manufacturing is the area most amenable to automation, since on the shop floor it is possible to radically simplify the environment in which machines work to enable autonomous operation. Industrial robotics has been around for a long time. The first robot, the Unimate, was installed in a General Motors plant in 1961. Still, until the late 1960s, scholars studying the sector were able to dismiss out of hand Luddite fears of long-term technological unemployment. And Luddite, I think he's using in the correct sense here. The original Luddites went around smashing up the industrial machinery that was putting them out of work. They weren't simply anti-technology, anti-progress. They were anti the capitalist machinery that was destroying their lives. And they dealt with it in person. Manufacturing employment grew most rapidly precisely in those lines where technical innovation was happening at the fastest pace, because it was in those lines that prices fell the fastest, stoking the growth of demand for products. I'm just going to read that again to make sure that I have fully internalized it, and I hope it helps you too. Manufacturing employment grew most rapidly precisely in those lines where technical innovation was happening at the fastest pace, because it was in those lines that prices fell the fastest, stoking the growth of demand for products. As we mentioned earlier, the dropping prices for products was not simply an effect of the productivity of automation, it was also, at least also, an effect of being able to crush the wages of the people employed by crushing their organization processes, de-skilling the workers and making them more replaceable. And so being able to lower their wages. That era is long over. Over the past 50 years, industrialization has given way to deindustrialization, and not just in any one line, but across the manufacturing sectors of most countries. The productivity paradox. In the scholarly literature, deindustrialization is most commonly defined as a decline in the share of manufacturing in total employment. That share fell first of all across the high-income world, starting in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Manufacturing employed 22% of all workers in the United States in 1970, a share that declined to just 8% in 2017. That's very extreme. Over the same period, manufacturing employment shares fell from 23% to 9% in France, and from 30% to 8% in the UK. Japan, Germany, and Italy experienced smaller but still substantial declines. In Japan, from 25 to 15%. In Germany, from 29% to 17%. And in Italy, from 25% to 15%. In all cases, the declines were eventually associated with substantial falls in the total number of people employed in manufacturing. In the US, Germany, Italy, and Japan, the overall number of manufacturing jobs fell by approximately a third from post-war peaks. In France, it fell by 50%, and in the UK by 67%. Ashran says, the reason productivity has been stagnating is because the most jobs are available in places that machines can't be provided with controlled conditions: farm labour, care work, and front-facing retail. Every 3 years, someone does, why don't we just give a robot arm a camera to harvest fruit, and then they find out why and go bankrupt. Yes, they love to assume that the working class needs no particular skills, and specifically, they love to assume that manual work requires no intelligence, and so it can simply be done by a machine. And they love to assume that employers know all of the understanding and skills necessary to perform that job and can reproduce it through simple, like, physical manufacturing processes, and it's simply not true. Just spilled water all over myself. It is commonly assumed that deindustrialization in these high-income countries must be the result of production facilities moving offshore. Offshoring has certainly contributed to deindustrialization in the United States and UK, which boast the world's largest trade deficits. Yet in none of the countries named above, including the United States and UK, has manufacturing job loss been associated with declines in absolute levels of manufacturing output. On the contrary, the volume of manufacturing production, as measured by real value added, more than doubled in the United States, France, Germany, Japan, and Italy between 1970 and 2017. Even the UK, whose manufacturing sector fared worst of all among this group, saw a 25% increase in manufacturing real value added over this period. To be sure, low and middle income countries are producing more and more goods for export to high income countries. However, deindustrialization in the latter cannot simply be the result of productive capacity moving to the former, since the high-income countries produced more manufacturing goods at the end of the 2010s than they had at any time in the past. In line with automation theorists' core expectations, more goods are being produced, but by fewer workers. It is on this basis that commentators typically cite rapidly rising labour productivity rather than an influx of low-cost imports from abroad as the primary cause of industrial job loss in advanced economies. So, rising labour productivity means that fewer workers can produce more. On closer inspection, however, this explanation also turns out to be inadequate. Manufacturing productivity has been growing at a sluggish pace for decades, leading economist Robert Solow to quip, "We see the computer age everywhere, except in the productivity statistics." Automation theorists discuss this productivity paradox as a problem for their account, explaining it in terms of weak demand for products or the persistent availability of low-wage workers, but they understate its true significance. This is partly due to the appearance of steady labour productivity growth in US manufacturing at an average rate of around 3% per year since 1950. On that basis, Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee suggest automation could show up in the compounding effects of exponential growth, rather than an uptick in the growth rate. However, Official US manufacturing growth rate statistics are vastly overinflated, since they log the production of computers with higher processing speeds as equivalent to the production of more computers. That's simply ridiculous. That's actually ridiculous. For that reason, government statistics suggest that productivity levels in the computers and electronics subsector rose at a galloping average annual rate of over 10% between 1987 and 2011, even as productivity growth rates outside of that subsector fell to around 2% per year over the same period. Starting in 2011, trends across the manufacturing sector worsened. Real output per person employed in the sector as a whole was lower in 2017 than in 2010. Productivity growth rates in manufacturing collapsed precisely when, according to automation theorists, they were supposed to be rising rapidly due to advancing technologies. Ashran says, I have seen a schematic for an automated apple harvester made in the 60s. It was just a pair of jet engines and a cherry picker on a tractor that blew air at the tree until the apples fell. Starting in 2011, trends across the manufacturing sector worsened. Oh, I already read that bit. That's okay. I'll read the next bit. Correction of the US manufacturing productivity statistics brings them more into line with trends in countries like Germany and Japan, where manufacturing productivity growth rates have fallen dramatically since their post-war peaks. In Germany, manufacturing productivity grew at an average annual rate of 6.3% per year in the 1950s and 60s, falling to 2.4% from 2000 to 2017. This downward trend was to some extent an expected result of the end of an era of rapid catch-up growth. However, it should still be surprising to automation theorists, since Germany and Japan have raced ahead of the United States in the field of industrial robotics. Indeed, the robots used in Tesla's largely automated car factory in California were made by a German robotics company. As of 2016, German and Japanese firms deployed about 60% more industrial robots per manufacturing worker compared to the US. Yet, deindustrialization has continued to take place in all these countries, despite lackluster manufacturing productivity growth rates. That is, it has taken place as the automation theorists expect, but not for the reasons they offer. To explore the causes of deindustrialization in more detail, I rely on the following definitions. Output, as used both above and below, is a measure of the volume of production, how much is produced, in terms of real or inflation-adjusted value added in a given economic sector. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is just value added for the economy as a whole. Employment, as I use it here, is a measure of the number of workers rather than of hours worked. The latter are typically unavailable outside of wealthier countries, while productivity is the ratio of output to employment. The more output is produced per worker, the higher that worker's productivity level. For any economic sector, the rate of growth of output minus the rate of growth of labor productivity equals the rate of growth of unemployment. Thus, rate of growth of output minus rate of growth of labor productivity equals rate of growth of unemployment. This equation is true by definition. If the output of automobiles grows 3% per year, and productivity in the automotive industry grows by 2% per year, then employment in that industry must have risen by 1% per year. Contrary-wise, if output grows by 3% per year and productivity grows by 4% per year, employment will have contracted by 1% per year. Thanks for hanging, geometric shapes. Glad you got to enjoy some. Disaggregation of manufacturing output growth rates in France provides us with a sense of the typical pattern playing out across the high-income countries. During the so-called golden age of post-war capitalism, productivity growth rates in French manufacturing were much higher than they are today. 5.2% per year on average between 1950 and 1973, but output growth rates were even higher than that, 5.9% per year. As a result, employment had to have grown steadily at a pace of 0.7% per year. Since 1973, both output and productivity growth rates have declined, but output growth rates fell much more sharply than productivity growth rates. By the early years of the 21st century, productivity was rising at a much less rapid pace than it had during the post-war era, at 2.7%. However, slower productivity growth rates were now faster than their corresponding industrial output growth rates at 0.9%. The result was that manufacturing employment contracted rapidly by 1.7% per year. Even before that contraction got going, deindustrialization had already technically begun. As soon as the rate of growth of manufacturing employment consistently fell below the rate of growth of the total workforce, the manufacturing employment share started its downward trend. This disaggregation helps explain why automation theorists falsely perceive productivity to be growing at a rapid pace in manufacturing. Productivity growth rates have been high relative to output growth rates, but not because productivity has been growing more rapidly than before, which would be a sure sign of accelerating automation. On the contrary, the key to this trend is that output has been growing much more slowly than before. The same pattern can be seen in the statistics of other countries. No absolute decline in levels of manufacturing production took place. More and more was produced. But the rate at which output grows declined, so output growth came to be consistently slower than productivity growth. As industrial output growth rates fell below corresponding productivity growth rates in country after country, quantitative declines in economic indicators became qualitative in their effects. Manufacturing employment shares fell progressively. Worsening economic stagnation thus combined with a limited technological dynamism to generate labor's global deindustrialization. Such output-led deindustrialization is impossible to explain in purely technological terms. In their search for alternative perspectives, economists have mostly preferred to describe this trend as a harmless evolutionary feature of advanced economies. However, that perspective is itself at a loss to explain extreme variations in the GDP per capita levels at which this supposedly evolutionary economic shift has taken place. So it's quite classic for, so Sophie describes this in her video, it's quite classic for the kind of liberal institutions to expect countries to develop along an economic pathway, which includes industrialization and then deindustrialization. And they say that's just the way it goes. That's just what progress looks like. And does it make any sense at all that that would just be the natural evolutionary development of an economy? Howdy, Matt J. Crowley. I'm reading Automation and the Future of Work by Aaron Benanav. And if anybody is enjoying the stream, learning anything, enjoying my my posh voice for quotes, do consider paying for the stream. You can donate directly, and you can cheer or subscribe. Whoa, so many options. Whoa. Where do we get to? However, that perspective is itself at a loss to explain extreme variations in the GDP per capita levels at which this supposedly evolutionary economic shift has taken place. Deindustrialization unfolded first in high-income countries in the late 1960s and early 1970s, at the tail end of a period in which levels of income per person had converged across the United States, Europe, and Japan. In the decades that followed, deindustrialization then spread prematurely to middle-income and low-income countries with larger variations in incomes per capita. In the late 1970s, deindustrialization arrived in Southern Europe, much of Latin America, parts of East and Southeast Asia, and Southern Africa followed in the 1980s and 90s. Peak industrialization levels in many poorer countries were so low that it may be more accurate to say they never industrialized in the first place. By the end of the 20th century, it was possible to speak of a global wave of deindustrialization. Worldwide manufacturing employment rose in absolute terms by 0.4% per year between 1991 and 2016. But that was much slower than the overall growth of the global labour force, with the result that the manufacturing share of total employment declined by 3 percentage points over the same period. China is a key exception, but only a partial one. In the mid-1990s, Chinese state-owned enterprises shed millions of workers, sending manufacturing employment shares on a steady downward trajectory. China reindustrialized, in employment terms, starting in the early 2000s, but then it began to deindustrialize once again in the mid-2010s. Its manufacturing employment share has since dropped significantly, from 19.3% in 2013 to 17.2% in 2018. If deindustrialization cannot be explained by either automation or the internal evolution of advanced economies, what could be its source? Blight of manufacturing overcapacity. The crisis of capitalism. This is a fundamental one. It's Ashrand, your frustration with all the people in charge, all the people who get paid to describe these processes, is extremely legitimate. What the economists' accounts fail to register in their explanations of deindustrialization is also what is missing from the automation theorists' accounts. The truth is that rates of output growth in manufacturing have tended to decline, not only in this or that country, but worldwide. In the 1950s and 60s, global manufacturing production expanded at an average annual rate of 7.1% per year in real terms. This rate fell progressively to 4.8% in the 1970s and to 3% between 1980 and 2007. From the 2008 crisis up to 2014, manufacturing output expanded at just 1.6% per year. On a world scale, that is, at less than a quarter of the pace achieved during the post-war Golden Age. It is worth noting that these figures include the dramatic expansion of manufacturing productive capacity in China. Again, it is the incredible degree of slowdown in the rate at which manufacturing production expands, visible on the world scale, that explains why manufacturing productivity growth appears to have advanced at a rapid clip, even though it was actually much slower than in previous eras. More and more is produced with fewer workers, as the automation theorists claim, but not because technological change has given rise to high rates of productivity growth. Far from it. Productivity growth in manufacturing has appeared rapidly only because the yardstick of output growth against which it is measured has been shrinking. Following economist Robert Brenner, I argue that global waves of deindustrialization find their origins not in runaway technical change, but first and foremost in a worsening overcapacity in world markets for manufactured goods. The rise in overcapacity developed stepwise after World War II. In the immediate post-war period, the United States hosted the most dynamic economy in the world with the most advanced technologies. In 1950, output per hour worked in the US economy was more than twice as high as output per hour in European countries. Under the threat of communist expansion within Europe, as well as in East and Southeast Asia, the US proved willing to share its technological largesse with its former imperial competitors, Germany and Japan, as well as with other frontline countries, in order to bring them all under the US security umbrella. In the first few decades of the post-World War II era, these technology transfers were a major boost to economic growth in European countries and Japan, opening up opportunities for rapid export-led expansion. This strategy was supported by the devaluation of their currencies against the dollar in 1949, which improved these countries' international competitiveness at the expense of domestic working-class buying power, a move that in many European countries led to the eviction of left political parties from government. However, as Brenner has argued, rising manufacturing capacity across the globe quickly generated overcapacity, issuing in a long downturn in manufacturing output growth rates. What mattered here was not only the later build-out of manufacturing capacity in the global south, but the earlier creation of such capacity in countries like Germany, France, Italy, and Japan. These countries hosted the first low-cost producers in the post-war era to succeed, first in taking shares in global markets for industrial goods, and second in invading the previously impenetrable US domestic market. Due to rising competition with lower-cost producers, rates of industrial output growth in the US began to decline starting in the late 1960s, issuing in deindustrialization in employment terms. As the US responded to heightened import penetration in the early 1970s by breaking up the Bretton Woods order and devaluing the dollar, which increased US firms' international competitiveness, these same problems spread from North America and Northwestern Europe to the rest of the European continent and Japan. Intensifying competition among firms in these high-income regions did not dissuade more countries from building up manufacturing capacity, adopting export-led growth strategies, and entering global markets for manufactured goods. As additional manufacturing capacity appeared and entered the fray of international competition, falling rates of manufacturing output growth and consequent labor deindustrialization spread to more regions. Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, as well as to the global economy taken as a whole. Doesn't what's happening here sound a lot like the crisis of the textile industry that I described earlier, that resulted in the adoption of fossil fuels for the purpose not of producing more textiles? They were already producing too many textiles. That was the reason that they were struggling to make profits in the first place. But to undermine and make replaceable the workforce that was making those products and making those profits so that they could be paid lower wages. Deindustrialization came to most global South regions in the aftermath of the 1982 Third World Debt Crisis amid the imposition of IMF-led structural adjustment programs. As trade liberalization opened the borders of poorer countries to imports, while financial liberalization brought hot money flowing into emerging markets, their currencies revalued sharply. Unit labor costs in these regions rose just as markets were becoming more overcrowded, with the result that firms found themselves able neither to compete with imports nor to export their wares abroad. Deindustrialization was a matter not only of technological advance, but also of global redundancy of productive and technological capacities. In more crowded international markets, rapid rates of industrial expansion became more difficult to achieve. The mechanism transmitting this problem across the world was depressed prices in global markets for manufactured goods, which also explains why shifting currency valuations played such a major role in determining competitiveness. As Harvard economist Danny Roderick notes, developing countries imported deindustrialization from the advanced countries because they were exposed to the relative price trends coming from the capitalist core. Everywhere, depressed prices for manufacturers led to falling income per unit capital ratios, falling capital productivity, then to falling rates of profit, then to lower rates of investment, and finally to lower output growth rates. In this environment, firms faced heightened competition for market share. As overall growth rates slowed, the only way for new firms to grow quickly was to steal market shares from established firms. The latter responded by retreating to the apex of global value chains. Overcapacity explains why, from the early 1970s, productivity growth rates fell less severely than output growth rates. Firms either raised their productivity levels as best they could, that means squeezing more from workers, in an effort to keep up with their competitors despite the slower growth of the demand for their products, or else went under, disappearing from statistical averages. The implementation of technological innovations, although occurring at a slower pace than before, generated sector-wide job loss. As output growth rates fell toward, and in many cases below, productivity growth rates, in one country after another, deindustrialization spread worldwide. So Sassini, I think what he's describing specifically as deindustrialization is fewer people employed in industrial manufacturing sectors. Explaining global waves of deindustrialization in terms of global overcapacity rather than industrial automation allows us to understand a number of features of this phenomenon that otherwise appear paradoxical. For example, rising overcapacity explains why deindustrialization has been accompanied not only by ongoing efforts to develop new labor-saving technologies, but also by the build-out of gigantic labor-intensive supply chains, usually with a more damaging environmental impact. A key turning point in that story came in the 1960s, when low-cost Japanese and German products invaded the US domestic market, sending the US industrial import penetration ratio soaring from less than 7% in the mid-60s to 16% in the early 70s. From that point forward, it became clear that high levels of labor productivity would no longer serve as a shield against competition from lower wage countries. The firms that did best in this, so that means that for manufacturers, they could no longer compete with products from other countries that were produced by perhaps very labor-intensive processes, very much not higher automation, but much, much lower wages. And so they could offer products cheaper on the global markets, that they could no longer compete by increasing their productivity. From that point forward, it became clear that high levels of labour productivity would no longer serve as a shield against competition from lower wage countries. The firms that did best in this context were the ones that responded by globalising production. Facing competition on prices, US multinational corporations built international supply chains, shifting the more labour-intensive components of their production processes abroad and playing suppliers against one another to achieve the best prices. In the mid-60s, the first export processing zones opened in Taiwan and South Korea. Even Silicon Valley, which formerly produced its computer chips locally in the San Jose area, shifted its production to low-wage areas using lower grades of technology while benefiting from laxer laws around pollution and workers' safety. MNCs in Germany and Japan adopted similar strategies, which were everywhere supported by new transportation and communication infrastructures. Yeah, Ashrand, I also squinted a bit at the use of the word invaded. Globalization of production allowed the world's wealthiest economies to retain manufacturing capacity, but it did not reverse the overall trend toward labor deindustrialization. As supply chains were built out across the world, firms in more and more countries were pulled into the swirl of world market competition. In some countries, this move was accompanied by shifts in the location of new plants. Rust belts, oriented toward production for domestic markets, went into decline. Sun belts, integrated into global supply networks, expanded dramatically. Chattanooga grew at the expense of Detroit. Juarez at the expense of Mexico City. Guangdong at the expense of Dongbei. Yet given the overall slowdown in the rates of world market expansion, this reorientation toward the world market resulted in lackluster outcomes. I'm just going to say that again. Yet given the overall slowdown in the rates of world market expansion, this reorientation toward the world market resulted in lackluster outcomes. The rise of Sun Belt failed to balance out the decline of Rust Belts, resulting in global deindustrialization. At the same time, global manufacturing overcapacity explains why the countries that have succeeded in attaining a high degree of roboticization are not those that have seen the worst degree of deindustrialization. Measured in terms of robots deployed per 1,000 workers in manufacturing, South Korea, Germany, and Japan have advanced much further along the road to full automation as compared to the United States and UK in 2016. Yet manufacturing employment shares in that same year were significantly higher in South Korea 17%, Germany 17%, and Japan 15%, than in the US 8% and UK 8%. In the context of intense global competition, high degrees of roboticization translate into international competitive advantages, helping firms win larger shares of world markets for the goods they produce. Unlike workers in the United States, workers in the European and East Asian firms believe that automation helps preserve their jobs. Chinese firms have also been major players in global markets for manufactured goods, providing China's industrial sector with a gigantic boost in terms of both growth output and employment growth. Output growth and employment growth. Yet Chinese firms advanced on this front not due to high levels of roboticization. In 2016, China deployed just 7 robots per 1,000 workers in manufacturing, but rather due to a mix of low wages, moderate to advanced technologies, and strong infrastructural capacities. Still, the result was the same. In spite of system-wide overcapacity and slow growth rates, China has industrialized rapidly because its firms have been able to take market share away from other firms, not only in the United States, but also in countries like Mexico and Brazil. It could not have been otherwise. In an environment where average growth rates are low, firms can only achieve high rates of growth by taking market share from their competitors. Whether China will be able to retain its competitive position as its wage levels rise remains an open question. Chinese firms have been roboticizing to try to head off this possibility. There we go. That was chapter 2. Look at us go. Look at us go. Chapter 2, done. Blammo. We're a third of the way through the book already. We tried nothing and we're all out of ideas. Do remember, if you're enjoying the stream, if you feel like you're learning anything, if you're having a nice bedtime story, do consider paying for the stream. You can tip in the thingamajiggy. You can share, you can subscribe. We really appreciate it. It's my birthday at the end of the month. It's gonna be my birthday. Sophie and I are gonna go to Paris. And we're gonna meet some base people and it's gonna be cool and fun. Thirsty work reading, isn't it? Thirsty work. I think, how long's this chapter? What was that one? Oh, next one's longer. Alright, I'm just gonna get started and then, how long are we going? 2 hours 20. Okay, good going. I'm not doing bad. I'm doing alright. Chapter 3, In the Shadow of Stagnation. The evidence I cited in the previous chapter to explain job loss in the manufacturing sector through worsening overcapacity may appear to have little purchase on the larger economy-wide trends that automation theorists attribute to growing technological dynamism. Stagnant wages, falling labour shares of income, declining labour force participation rates, and jobless recoveries after recessions. Automation may therefore still seem like a good explanation for the decline in the demand for labour across the service sectors of each country's economy, and so across the world economy as a whole. Yet automation has had even less of an impact in services than it has in manufacturing. In fact, the broader problem of declining labour demand also turns out to be better explained by worsening industrial stagnation. By the worsening industrial stagnation I have described, than it is by widespread technological dynamism. This is because, as rates of manufacturing output growth stagnated in one country after another from the 1970s onward, no other sector appeared on the scene to replace industry as a major economic growth engine. Instead, the slowdown in manufacturing output growth rates was accompanied by a slowdown in overall GDP growth rates, running down the growth engine. These entwined trends are easily visible in the economic statistics of high-income countries. France is a striking example. In France, real manufacturing value added, MVA, rose at 5.9% per year between 1950 and 1973, while real value added in the total economy, GDP, rose at 5.1% per year. From 1973 on, both growth measures declined significantly. By the 2001 to 17 period, MVA, that's real manufacturing value added, was rising at only 0.9% per year, while GDP was rising at a faster but still sluggish pace of 1.2% per year. Note that during the 1950s and 60s, MVA growth generally led the economy. Manufacturing served as the major engine of overall growth. Beginning in 1973, MVA growth rates trailed overall economic growth. Similar patterns can be seen in other countries. Export-led growth engines sputtered. As they did so, overall rates of economic growth slowed to a crawl in country after country. Economists studying deindustrialization often point out that while manufacturing has declined as a share of normal GDP, it has maintained, until recently, a more or less steady share of real GDP. Declined as a share of nominal GDP. What does that mean? Economists studying deindustrialization often point out that while manufacturing has declined as a share of nominal GDP, it has maintained, until recently, a more or less steady share of real GDP. Which is to say that between 1973 and 2000, real manufacturing value added grew at approximately the same pace as real GDP. There was no significant shift in demand from industry to services. What that means in practice was that as manufacturing became less dynamic, so did the overall economy. Doing good didn't show me a single Spectator article. Cool stream. I'm glad. You're doing really good. There's a lot of information packed into these chapters. Thank you both. And thank you, Pillbug. Yeah. I'm definitely getting tuckered out, but I'm having a good time. But, you know, it's a little bit of information to process, but I think it's saying some recognizable things that are worth thinking about. Expecting post-war trends to continue as like starting to recover from the flu and thinking that if you continue to get better for 3 years, you will be able to carry a train. Yeah, I like that. That's, yes. I'm gonna snooze the ad break. Go away, ad break. Snooze. Oh no, it won't let me. Okay. There's an ad break coming in 4 minutes. Stupid Twitch. The primary mechanism transmitting the downturn from manufacturing to the wider economy was a slowing pace of investment, corresponding to a decline in the demand for goods and services used to expand production. That, in turn, depressed consumption demand through reduced hiring. Seen from the perspective of the total economy, overcapacity appears as underinvestment, albeit one without a clear solution, since it is structural in character. Thank you, Pillbug! Across the advanced capitalist countries, the growth rate of the capital stock, that is, the value of structures, equipment, and software measured in constant prices, has declined over time. For example, in the United States, the capital stock grew at a rate of 3.6% per year between 1951 and 1973, falling to 2.8% per year between 1974 and 2000, and 1.8% per year between 2001 and 2017. After 2009, the capital stock grew at an average annual pace of just 1.3%. As the average firm has invested less in expanding its fixed capital base, average labour productivity growth rates have declined as well. Why and when would firms have started investing less in their growth rates? Maybe when they started having to pay masses and masses and masses less tax as a proportion of their profits. That is because labour-saving innovations tend to be embodied in capital goods, or else typically require complementary investments in capital goods to be realised. In the United States, labour productivity grew at a rate of 2.4% per year between 1951 and 1973, falling to 1.4% per year between 1974 and 2000, and 1.2% per year between 2001 and 2017. Between 2011 and 2017, productivity grew at just 0.7% per year. Similar trends unfolded in other high-income countries and were even more severe. The tendency to economy-wide stagnation associated with a decline in manufacturing dynamism then explains the system-wide decline in the demand for labour. And so also the problems that automation theorists cite: stagnant real wages, falling labour shares of income, and so on. The economy-wide pattern of declining labour demand has not been the result of rising productivity growth rates and associated with automation in the service sector. Ad break coming. On the contrary, productivity has grown even more slowly outside of the manufacturing sector than inside of it. In Germany and Japan, for example, while productivity in the manufacturing sector was rising at an average annual rate of 2.2% and 2.7% respectively between 2001 and 2017, productivity in the economy as a whole was rising at just 0.7% in both countries. Ad break in 1 second. Yo. This is probably an ad. Does it tell me when the ad's done? It says when it's gonna be there. Tell me when the ad's done, and I'll carry on. My computer is telling me that it's humid, and yes, it is. I can feel that already. Thank you for telling me, computer. It is humid today. Okay. I shall carry on. Thank you, Ceci. Oh, now it's telling me the ad break is still happening and ends in 22 seconds. That's so long. That's so long. Maybe it's just you and me, Cecini. And the people watching on the archive channel, this is for you. You can still tip, you know, you can still send a little tip if you like. Okay. I'll carry on. Once again, the mistake of the automation theorists is to assume that productivity is rising at a rapid pace, whereas in fact, output growth rates have declined sharply over time. These trends are as visible in the world economy, including China, as they are in the high-income countries. In the 1950s and 60s, global MVA growth, and MVA growth was real manufacturing value added. From the 1970s onward, as global MVA growth slowed, so did global GDP growth. In most of the decades that followed, global MVA growth continued to lead GDP growth, but by a much smaller margin. Between 2008 and 2014, both rates grew at the exceptionally slow pace of 1.6% per year. Again, the implication is that as manufacturing growth rates declined, nothing emerged to replace industry as a growth engine. Not all regions of the world economy experienced this slowdown in the same way or to the same extent, but even countries like China, that have grown quickly, had to contend with this global slowdown and its consequences. After 2010, China's economic growth rate slowed considerably, and its economy has been deindustrializing. The same is true in India. Other BRICS economies, South Africa, Russia, and Brazil, fared even worse. By 2011, their growth rates were collapsing, and that was before the COVID-19 crisis, which has resulted in significant cuts to manufacturing production worldwide. Global MVA and GDP growth rates are likely to decline further in the 2020s. Reflection on more than half a century of economic trends demonstrates that manufacturing was a unique engine of economic growth. Industrial production tends to be amenable to incremental increases in productivity achieved via technologies that can be repurposed across numerous lines. Industry also benefits from major economies of scale, which raise productivity levels as the volume of production increases. In fact, according to an economic regularity known as Verdun's law, the faster the rate of growth of industrial output, the faster too is the rate of productivity growth. Some commentators describe the present period of economic stagnation in terms of an exhaustion of the frontiers of technological advance, as if there were nothing left to invent. But it is more likely that low rates of industrial productivity growth are the result of a slower pace of industrial expansion, rather than the reverse. Meanwhile, there is no necessary boundary to the industrial sector. Industry consists of all economic activities that are capable of being rendered via an industrial process, and more activities are so rendered over time. The reallocation of workers from low productivity jobs in agriculture, domestic industry, and domestic services to high productivity jobs in factories raises levels of income per worker and hence economic growth rates. The countries that have caught up with the West in terms of income, such as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, mostly did so by industrializing. They exploited opportunities to produce for the world market at increasing scale and with advanced technologies, allowing them to grow at speeds that would have been unachievable had they depended on domestic market demand alone. Manufacturing's importance may seem surprising given that, in terms of value added, the sector accounts for a shrinking share of economic activity. However, in terms of gross output, which, unlike value added, includes the costs of intermediate inputs, that is, the goods and services consumed by firms, manufacturing's footprint on the wider economy is significantly larger. Even in the United States, a country with a large trade deficit, manufacturing gross output accounted for 42% of total GDP in 2000. That share fell to 30% over the course of the 2010s, a decade that saw worsening economic stagnation. In Japan, manufacturing gross output's share of GDP was still higher, 59% in 2017. The lack of alternatives. When the growth engine of industrialization has sputtered due to the replication of technical capacities, international redundancy, and fierce competition for markets, there has been no replacement for it as a source of rapid growth. Indeed, the reallocation of workers from low productivity jobs to high productivity instead of a reallocation of workers from low productivity jobs to high productivity ones, the reverse takes place. Workers pool in low productivity jobs, mostly in the service sector. As countries have deindustrialized, they have also seen a massive build-up of financialized capital, chasing returns to the ownership of relatively liquid assets rather than investing long-term in new fixed capital. In spite of the high degree of overcapacity in industry, there is nowhere more profitable in the real economy for capital to invest itself. If there had been, we would have evidence of it in higher rates of capital accumulation, and hence higher GDP growth rates. Instead, what we see is ongoing disinvestment, with corporations using idle cash to buy back their own shares or pay out dividends, and falling long-term interest rates as the supply of loanable funds far outstrips demand. Under these conditions, huge quantities of money have flowed into financial assets. The expansion of gigantic asset bubbles periodically creates a wealth effect, as richer households use more of their annual incomes for consumption, since their assets appear to be saving money for them. The US economy has become ever more dependent on such bubble-driven spending. When the bubbles pop, those same wealthy households withdraw from consumption to pay down their debts, generating long periods of economic malaise, sometimes called Japanification, since the first country to experience balance sheet stagnation was Japan, after its bubble popped in 1991. Following the deflation of economic bubbles, the onset of slower growth renders manifest the absence of a sustainable alternative growth engine to manufacturing. Indeed, in spite of their financialization, the fortunes of wealthier economies have remained strongly tied to the fate of their manufacturing sectors, which helps explain why firms have reacted to overaccumulation by trying to make their existing manufacturing capacity more flexible and efficient, rather than ceding ground to lower-cost firms from other countries. Hello, Laku! Luddism for the win. For example, in the late 1980s and early 90s, US manufacturing briefly recovered from its malaise due to a dramatic decline in the value of the dollar, which, when combined with stagnant real wages and falling corporate taxes, improved the international competitiveness of American industrial firms significantly at the expense of the US domestic working class. This period saw a revival in the fortunes of the US economy and has been studied as a mini boom led by information and communications technology. But the US economy in this period did not function in isolation of global trends. The decline in the value of the dollar after 1985 corresponded to a rise in the value of European and Japanese currencies, issuing in declining manufacturing competitiveness for European and Japanese firms, falling rates of fixed capital investment, and slowing economic growth rates. There was no ICT-related economic upturn in these regions. On the contrary, rates of economic growth slowed secularly across Europe and Japan from the 1970s to the early 2000s. In Japan, capital existing from manufacturing flowed into financial assets, leading to the expansion of its infamous real estate bubble, the largest of the asset bubble era, whose later deflation sent the Japanese economy into a tailspin and threatened to take down the world economy. Emergency response measures employed by the Bank of Japan in the early 1990s later provided the template on which both the US Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank relied in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crash. A wider global crisis was averted in the mid-1990s only because the United States proved willing to engineer a revaluation of the dollar that gave the Japanese and German economies room to recover their international positions to some extent. However, an unintended consequence of this rescue operation was that the United States and the East Asian countries whose currencies had been tied to the dollar, such as South Korea, then saw their nascent booms transformed into bubbles. Their manufacturing sectors no longer served as engines of a more expansive economic growth, and capital fled into financial assets. The deflation of the resulting asset bubbles in East Asia in 1997 and in the US in 2001 and again in 2007 revealed deeper structural tendencies towards stagnation due to industrial overcapacity and underinvestment. The failure to find a sustainable alternative to the manufacturing growth engine also explains why governments in poorer countries have encouraged domestic producers to try to break into international markets for manufacturers, even though they are oversupplied. Waste. Capitalism produces waste. It's the overproduction is the problem. Nothing has replaced those markets as a major source of globally accessible demand. Overcapacity exists in agriculture too, and is even worse there than in industry. Meanwhile, services, which are mostly non-tradable, make up only a tiny share of global exports. If countries are to retain any dependable link to the international market under these conditions, they must find some way to insert themselves into industrial lines. Between 2001 and 2007, rising rates of global manufacturing expansion briefly created an opening for export-led development across the BRICS economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, inspiring some economists to theorize that the incomes of richer and poorer regions were converging, reversing their centuries-long divergence due to the lasting legacy of colonialism. However, this mini-boom turned out to depend on debt-fueled consumption in the high-income countries, which ended abruptly after the 2007 deflation of the US housing bubble, once again revealing a wider tendency to industrial overcapacity and underinvestment worldwide. Economic downshifts were particularly devastating for low and middle income countries in this era, not only because they were poorer, but also because those downshifts took place in an era of rapid labor force expansion. From 1980 to 2018, the world's workforce, both waged and unwaged, grew by about 75%, adding more than 1.5 billion people to the world's labor markets. These labor market entrants, living mostly in poorer countries, had the misfortune of growing up and looking for work at a time when global industrial overcapacity began to shape patterns of economic growth in post-colonial countries. declining rates of manufactured import growth in the United States and Europe in the 1970s and early 80s ignited the 1982 Third World Debt Crisis, followed by IMF-led structural adjustment, which pushed countries to deepen their imbrications in global markets at a time of ever slower global growth and rising competition from China. Some may respond that such low rates of global growth are in fact nothing out of the ordinary, if only we shift our baseline from the exceptional post-war golden age to previous periods, such as the pre-World War I era. But a global perspective on the decline in demand for labour provides the answer to this objection. It is true that during the Belle Epoque, 1870 to 1913, average rates of economic growth were more comparable to growth rates today. However, in that period, large sections of the population still lived in the countryside and produced much of what they needed to live. Slower economic growth rates are not a disastrous catastrophe when people are able to produce what they need to live for themselves for the most part. And are not forced into dependence on commodified housing, food, etc., by the state. European empires overran the globe, not only limiting the diffusion of new manufacturing technologies to a few regions, but also actively deindustrializing the rest of the world economy. Yet in spite of the much more limited sphere in which labour markets were active, and in which industrialization took place, the pre-World War I era, like the interwar period, was marked by a persistently low demand for labour, making for employment insecurity, rising inequality, and tumultuous social movements aimed at transforming economic relations. In this respect, the world of today does look like the world of the Belle Epoque. The difference, however, is that today, a much larger share of the world's population depends on finding work in labour markets to live, and thus finds itself subject to the insecurity attendant on looking for work in a low labour demand economy. Meanwhile, average economic growth rates in our times are likely to fall further as unresolved tendencies to economic stagnation are compounded by COVID-19. Historical precedents suggest that, in contrast to wars, pandemics are followed by long-lasting declines in GDP growth rates, rather than post-pandemic economic booms. Ashran says, how could this have happened? The IMF solves everything. Technology's role. What automation theorists describe as the result of rising technological dynamism is actually the consequence of worsening economic stagnation, following on decades of manufacturing overcapacity and underinvestment. These theorists assume that an accelerating pace of productivity growth is the main driver of the declining demand for labour, when in reality the main driver is a decelerating pace of output growth. This mistake is not without reason. The demand for labour is determined by the gap between productivity and output growth rates. Reading the shrinkage of this gap the wrong way around, that is, as due to rising productivity rather than falling output rates, is what generates the upside-down world of the automation discourse. Proponents of this discourse then search for the technological evidence that supports their view of the causes of low labour demand. In making this leap, the automation theorists miss the true story that explains this phenomenon. Overcrowded global markets for manufacturers, declining rates of investment in fixed capital, and a corresponding economic slowdown. Yet, even if automation is not itself the primary cause of a low demand for labour, it is still true that in a slow-growing economy, technological change can give rise to massive job destruction. Witness, for example, the US manufacturing sector's rapid job shedding between 2000 and 2010. Where the economy growing quickly, new jobs would easily be generated to replace those that had been lost. What we would be seeing then would be a classic example of creative destruction. By contrast, in an environment of persistent economic slowdown, workers who lose their jobs face significant hurdles in looking for work. A clarification of these wider economic conditions allows us to revisit the question of technology's role in job loss and explain why automation may be a misleading term for how it typically occurs. Booms for the few, yeah. In seeking to understand the links between technology and job loss, the automation theorists do themselves a disservice. Across much of the literature, research and development in the digital age is presented as a matter of engineers in white lab coats following the technology wherever it leads them, without having to worry about end results or social outcomes. Graphs of exponentially rising computer capacities, with Moore's law of rising processor speeds standing in for technical change in general, suggests that technology develops automatically down preset paths. That suggestion in turn feeds into the fantasy of a coming singularity, when machine intelligence will finally give birth to science fiction style artificial general intelligence, developing at speeds far beyond human comprehension. In reality, technological development is highly resource intensive, forcing researchers to pursue certain paths of inquiry at the expense of others. In our society, firms must focus on developing technologies that lead to profitable outcomes. Turning profits off of digital services, which are mostly offered to end users for free online, has proven elusive. Rather than focus on generating advances in artificial general intelligence, engineers at Facebook spend their time studying slot machines to figure out how to get people addicted to their website, so that they keep coming back to check for notifications, post content, and view advertisements. The result is that, like all modern technologies, these digital offerings are far from socially neutral. The internet, as developed by the US government and shaped by capitalist enterprises, is not the only internet that could exist. Are we listening, Jeff Bezos, owner of Twitch? One happy chipmunk. I've been looking for an internship recently, and one of them is focused on the buzzword Industry 4.0, which is a combination of the AI craze and the automation craze. I'm very sorry. Yeah. You may enjoy Sophie's upcoming video about AI and startups and capitalism and all of it. The same can be said of robotics. In choosing among possible pathways of technological progress, capital's command over the work process remains paramount. Technologies that would empower line workers are not pursued, whereas technologies allowing for detailed surveillance of those same workers are fast becoming hot commodities. These features of technological change in capitalist societies have important implications for anyone seeking to turn existing technical means toward new, emancipatory aims. Profit-driven technological advances are highly unlikely to overcome human drudgery as such, at least on their own, especially where labour remains cheap, plentiful and easily exploited. Nevertheless, if technical change will not end work altogether, it does periodically result in sweeping job destruction in certain industries. Sometimes that's because technologies allow for the full automation of a particular work process. More often, it's because technical innovations allow firms to overcome long-standing impediments to raising labor productivity in specific industries. Agriculture, for example, was one of the first sectors to be transformed by modern production methods. In the 15th and 16th century English countryside, new forms of animal husbandry on enclosed farms were combined with crop rotation to raise yields, yet farming remained difficult to mechanize due to the uneven terrain of fields and seasonal cycles, and for centuries it continued to be a major source of employment. In the 1940s, advances in synthetic fertilizers, the hybridization of crops, the mechanization of farming implements, and the development of pesticides finally made it possible to develop industrialized forms of agricultural production and animal husbandry, causing operative logics to shift. Labor productivity took off, as farms came to resemble open-air factories. Given the limits to growth of the demand for agricultural outputs, the sector then shed workers at an incredible pace. As late as 1950, agriculture employed 24% of the workforce in West Germany, 25% in France, 42% in Japan, and 47% in Italy. By 2010, all of these shares were under 5%. During the 1950s and 60s, Green Revolution, methods of industrialized agriculture were adapted for tropical climates, with stunning consequences for global agricultural employment. In the 1980s, the majority of the world's workers were still in agriculture. By 2018, that figure had fallen to 28%. Thus, the major destroyer of livelihoods in the 20th century was not silicon capitalism, but nitrogen capitalism. No automatic mechanism existed within the labor market to ensure that new jobs were created for the hundreds of millions of people who were forced to exit from agriculture. In the 21st century, as in previous periods, inventors and engineers will figure out how to overcome resistances to industrial development in additional lines of production. The problem is that in an era of slower economic growth, productivity growth rates tend to fall. Firms forego major investments in expanding their productive capacities. Many new gadgets on display in trade shows thus fail to find their way onto shop floors. This is not to say that productivity will not grow at a fast pace in some industries. For example, long-haul trucking, retail, and wholesale trade may shed jobs in the coming years due to a variety of technological breakthroughs. However, it is hard to say what share of these jobs will be eliminated at rates of capital accumulation and labor productivity growth as rates of capital accumulation and labor productivity growth decelerate across the economy. On the global scale, much more concerning than the mechanization of trucks or warehouses would be the mechanization of apparel and footwear industries and of electronics assembly. These sectors employ large numbers of people worldwide and generate foreign exchange for otherwise cash-strapped economies. Sewing in particular has long been resistant to technological modernization. It involves detailed work with fabrics, which machines have trouble manipulating. The last major innovation in the field was the Singer sewing machine in the 1850s. Electronics assembly work, although of more recent vintage, has proven similarly resistant to labor-saving innovations since it too requires the delicate manipulation of tiny parts. As technological laggards within larger, highly mechanized production processes, these jobs were some of the first to globalize in the 1960s, when retail, apparel, and electronics firms contracted suppliers in low-wage countries to meet a growing demand. These industries remain significant as the first links of industrial supply chains, where they are subject to fierce competition among suppliers. Much of this work relocated to China beginning in the 1990s. However, just as Chinese wages have risen, making countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh more industrially competitive, advances in robotics may finally be overcoming long-standing resistance to further mechanization within these fields. Capital accumulation is still unfolding at a more rapid pace in East and Southeast Asia, where much of this production takes place, meaning new inventions are more likely to be implemented as innovations in business practice. Foxconn is deploying Foxbots on their electronics assembly lines to stave off competition from assemblers in lower wage countries. In China and Bangladesh, apparel companies are using sewbots as well as new knitting technologies that have already been extended to the manufacture of fly knit footwear. These innovations are unlikely to lead to full automation in these sectors, but they could eliminate lots of jobs quickly and block access to the global economy for further low-wage countries, for example in Africa. It is unclear whether these technological developments are 10 or 20 years away, and they may not occur on any scale at all. Yet, even without major advances in automation, Industry 4.0 and smart factory technologies may increase the advantages of industrial clustering in the vicinity of related services, with the result that manufacturing jobs are more likely to be globally concentrated than dispersed. By overcoming impediments to mechanization in sectors that have hitherto acted as major labor absorbers, new technologies may serve as a secondary cause for the under-demand for labor. However, the key to explaining this phenomenon is not the rapid pace of job destruction in these branches of production, but rather the absence of a correspondingly rapid pace of job creation in the wider economy. As I have argued, the main explanation for the latter is not runaway technological change, as the automation theorists claim, since that would show up in economic statistics as a rapid rate of productivity growth. In reality, productivity growth rates are slowing down, not speeding up. The low demand for labor in the wider economy finds its true source in the slackening pace of overall economic growth, associated with the running down of the manufacturing growth engine and the failure to find an alternative to it. The tendency toward economic stagnation will only intensify in the COVID-19 pandemic era. It is for this reason that predictions of a coming wave of pandemic-induced automation ring so hollow. They mistake the technical feasibility of automation, itself more of a shaky hypothesis than a proven result, for its economic viability. Undeniably, some firms are investing in robotics in response to COVID-19. For example, Walmart has purchased self-driving, inventory scanning, and aisle cleaning robots for its US stores. Expecting online ordering to continue to expand exponentially, some retail shops are testing out, but not yet widely implementing, robotics-assisted micro-fulfillment centers to help pickers assemble orders more quickly. However, these are likely to be exceptions to the rule for the foreseeable future, with little reason to expect the demand for their producers to increase following the onset of a deep recession. Few firms will undertake major new investments. Instead, firms will make do with the productive capacities they already possess, achieving cost savings by shedding labor and speeding up the pace of work for the remaining workers. Too often, commentators simply assume that automation accelerated in the last decade and based their predictions for the future on this false reckoning of the past. The demand could not be found to justify such investments. In the United States, the 2010s saw the lowest rates of capital accumulation and productivity growth in the post-war era. COVID-19 will only tend to make things worse. All right, I think that's a good place for us to pause, and I will return and read how far have I got through this. So I've read 3 chapters, and there are getting towards halfway through. So I'm very proud of us. Well done, everyone. Before I head, because you know, we've done well. I'm getting sleepy. There's only so much information you can really process in one chunk. I think it's good to not read the whole thing all at once if we can manage it. But I hope everybody enjoyed that. If you have been enjoying it, do consider leaving a little tip or a little sub. Really appreciate it. I had loads of fun doing that. I'm really, really grateful for everyone I'm like a really decent number of people sticking around for some tasty little theory reading. Some Automation and the Future of Work by Benanav. I'm really appreciating what he's saying so far, and while it is challenging to read many statistics in a row, I am quite pleased with myself for relatively being able to keep up with what he's saying. So well done, us. Good job, us. Thank you, Ashrand. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I'll be back to read the next chunk, potentially the whole of the rest, because we are about like halfway through. So nice little nugget here sometime soon, and I'll try and I'll try and say ahead of time when I'm going to do it, because I appreciate that this was kind of like a spontaneous thing, but some people might want to make sure they can check out the rest of the book. So I'll say in the days ahead of time that I'm planning to read the rest of it. All right, thanks everybody. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you everyone for hanging out and listening to economic stuff.